If you've been watching the news, you know that higher education's got a whole lot of business going on. It's always been a place of, protesting and things. I mean, we can't forget that Kent State here in Northeast Ohio was the kind of the focal point of a lot of Vietnam protests many years ago.
May 4th, 1970.
And we talked about that. Remember on some sort of ominous anniversary of that, we talked about it at length here. So the fact that there's protests in colleges is not super surprising.
Right.
But I think the whole country was like, what are you people doing? And I think in some respects, you could see it from both sides of the aisle were a little bit mystified by the intensity. And it's like, what are you paying $100,000 to camp and not go to class?
I saw an example in the news of what I thought was a good protest. Garfield CLC, which is part of the Akron Public Schools, the superintendent had just put out a budget for the next year, which meant like 250 some employees were going to lose their jobs.
Oof.
And at that point, they hadn't notified who it would or would not be. But the students wanted to express support for their teachers. So they rallied around and set a walkout 3 p.m. on, I think it was Friday.
It's like the very end of the day, I'd imagine.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're not missing much of the school day. You're making your stance, but nobody's going to hang around and camp out at the school on a Friday afternoon. They're going to make their little rally, rah, 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 let's keep the teachers, and then boom, off they go. And I thought, well, there, you've been active, you've made your point known, and no windows are broken, and nobody's leaving trash all across the schoolyard. It's over and done.
Yeah. And I mean, protests are an American ideal, the right to peaceably assemble. It's a thing we have in our Constitution. And now, many people have pontificated.
Ooh. David Mullane would like that word.
About like what's wrong with what they're doing. But I think the more interesting question is, why is it? Like, how did we get here? Like, what's the cause of kind of the downfall of higher education in the U.S.? And not downfall, it's melodramatic.
Yeah, if
like
it is a downfall.
Yeah, the slippage, the problems, the issues, what's the cause of it? And what I think of when we get to the cause of this is some of what I experienced. I had a great experience in my undergraduate degree. You ladies would laugh at me. I don't know if I know I told Ron like 16 times, but when I went to high school, apparently I thought it was cool to wear khakis and like a button-up shirt to class. My wife questions whether that was actually cool. But anyway, I remember I took a Western civilization course. I was a social studies major. You're like, wait, that's a major? Yeah, I was going to be trained to be a high school social studies teacher. So a broad field major. I took a gen ed, like 100-level Western Civ course. And I wore my khakis and a button-up shirt to class and quickly went back to change because everybody's in like sweats and T-shirts, I was like, whoa, what a nerd. And I got my little syllabus. And I remember like the first week of class, every day I'd leave class going, it was a professor, Professor Mariana Byman, and I'd leave going, this woman gets paid for this? I was like thinking about calling my parents and saying, I can't believe we're paying for this. Mm-hmm. Because she would assign us to read a primary document. So she'd assign us to read an excerpt of a famous work by Plato or whoever, read some of Homer's Iliad. And then you'd get to class and she'd sit there and ask us questions about it. And we'd discuss. And I'd sit there kind of going like, when are you going to start teaching? I'm paying for this, lady. But then I realized after about a week that I spent my entire day thinking about the discussions from that class. Mm. And pretty soon I realized, wait a minute, I'm learning.
Yeah.
And this is a powerful way to learn. It's a basic Socratic method. You're reading a classic work and someone is asking you questions about it and you're discussing it. And profound learning takes place in the midst of that. Mm-hmm. And I fell deeper in love with social sciences and the idea of teaching that idea. It's one of the reasons I love critical thinking so much. It's because at least the professors at that particular state college, Winona State University, go Warriors! Yeah, everyone loves that. Like they didn't care your position personally. I was never castigated for my Christian faith. And I was open about it in class and in papers. They just wanted you to think. And so I think that's one of the critiques here from the New York Times. So take a listen to the way they write it, and we'll see what we think. The right attacks colleges and universities as leftist and woke. Progressive castigate them as perpetuating patriarchy and white privilege. The burdens of these culture war assaults are compounded by parents worried about the exorbitant costs of higher education not being worth it. No wonder America's faith in universities is at a low. Only 36% of Americans have confidence in higher education, according to Gallup. Oh, that's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised it's that high at this point.
Yeah, the more you think about it, I can see that.
Having only graduated from one of these institutions 4 years ago, I'm surprised it's as high as that is.
But the problems facing American higher education are not just the protests and culture war attacks on diversity, course content, speech, and speakers. The problem is that higher education is fundamentally misunderstood. In response, colleges and universities must reassert the liberal arts ideals that have made them great, but they have been slipping away. By liberal arts, we mean a broad-based education that aspires to send out into society an educated citizenry prepared to make its way responsibly in an ever more complex and divided world. Over the past century, what's made American higher education the best in the world is not its superiority in career training, but educating students for democratic citizenship, cultivating critical thinking, and contributing to the personal growth of its students through self-creation. To revive American higher education, we need to reinvigorate these roots. And it goes on to say lots of different things, and then it goes on to say, historically, students arriving on American college campuses spend a majority of their first 2 years taking classes outside of their projected majors. This exposed them to common curriculum that had them engage with thoughtful writings of the past to develop the skills and capacity to form sound, independent judgments. The so-called great books have long been a preferred way to foster citizenship. This approach is not, contrary to critics on the left and the right, about sanctifying specific texts for veneration or a mechanism for heritage transmission, but books like Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, Locke, Kant, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, Wollstonecraft, Austen, Woolf, Baldwin, Hearst, Orwell, all these are what cultivate ultimately, this guy's saying, or these writers are saying, the ability for American citizens to become good citizens by teaching them how to think about different perspectives. And it helps people ultimately be critical analyzers, and form judgments, and think about other people's ideas, be sensitive, be thoughtful, not freak out when someone disagrees.
Mm-hmm.
I've kind of always wondered if some of a problem about higher education is we hire faculty who are experts in that field, but they're not educators.
Yeah.
So they don't know how to teach people. They know how to lecture about something, and they know how to talk about their area of expertise, but they don't know how to educate people.
I'd argue some of them don't even know how to talk about their area of expertise. Like, I had a couple professors that were just so smart and so into their field. They had no clue how to teach, a 20, 21-year-old from scratch.
Right.
Oh, yeah. No.
I had two professors at Moody who were an expert in their field, but they also had their master's in education. And so they knew how to teach people. And they did that very thing, the Socratic method of teaching, where it's just an open discussion. And I want to know, like, them as a professor, I want to know what you think. Or they would have us read a work, and then teach it back to the class. And then the class got to ask us questions. So it's as if we're the expert in the area and we're getting feedback from our classmates.
Yeah, and they kind of moderate discussion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's where intense learning takes place. It doesn't look like it or feel like it at first. In my description earlier, I really was disoriented. Like, what is happening here? You're supposed to tell me things and I memorize them, But that's not really how deep learning takes place. I actually had a sociology professor whose handwriting was illegible on his overhead projector when he would lecture.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got to this class period before a test. A woman raises her hand in the back and she goes, "I don't understand any of this."
Good for her.
He said, "Don't try to understand. make lists and memorize.
Oh,
No.
Oh no.
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 The worst teacher I've ever had.
no.
And yet, some of the best teachers I've ever experienced were in my undergraduate degree. Some of the best. And now I would say we can't just blame higher education, because as a former high school teacher, it's part of the problem in secondary education as well. And it's not the teacher's fault. You know whose fault it is? Ours. Because here's our expectation. We go, yeah, these high school teachers, they don't know what they're doing. Bunch of losers trying to indoctrinate our kids. Here's what we need. We need to test whether they're doing this right. So we're going to come up with standardized tests that prove their teaching. And so then what happens is all teachers can do is teach to standardized tests. And so actual teaching and discussion don't take place because there's no time. They have to make kids memorize things and learn these equations and move on.
Yeah, they can not use any creativity in their teaching because that might lead to a lesser score of their students on the test, which would reflect poorly on them.
Correct. Now, I mean, and part of it, to be honest, Christian parents get mad when evolution is discussed. But in a healthy Socratic method environment, why wouldn't you want your kid to hear a critical analysis of evolution, of creationism? I mean, when I was teaching years ago, I still felt I had some of that academic freedom. I taught world religions. And we did comparative analysis of world religions and what they're all about. I was able to teach the gospel in my class.
And we've talked about how so many of us and of society, you grow up in the church, and then in your end of your teens and in your 20s, you're leaving home and you're branching out, becoming an adult, and one of the things you do is look at your faith, and you're like, do I really believe this? Do I really think Jonah was swallowed by a great fish, or that David killed a giant with just a slingshot? All those stories we've heard in Sunday school. Well, if you've had a critical discussion of evolution as well, you'll be able to take that in and go, that side has some problems too. Instead of just lockstep, well, if I'm not going to believe in Jesus, then I am going to believe this evolution and not investigate it at all. If you've already investigated, there's problems.
Yeah, I think parents are actually making their kids have weaker faith by not exposing them to other ideas because they don't know how to think critically. And they're going to have a crisis when there's one thing that seems to come up against their faith, which they've been taught their whole life. They don't know how to deal with this. They don't know how to think through each idea and figure out what's true.
Well, yeah, and you can probably see, if you've been a long-time listener of the show, this is why we do what we do, because I'm passionate about this. That if you want to grow in your faith, you have to ask hard questions and consider other positions, because you don't have it all figured out. Neither do I. I don't. It might sound sometimes like when we're talking like, wow, he sure thinks he knows what he's talking about. No, he's just trying to make you think. That's all. You don't have to agree with me. I don't want you to agree with me. I want you to search the scriptures and come to a deeper understanding in your life. And that's what I think much of American society is missing today. We've lost the ideal of the value of reading great works, asking big questions, and allowing people to think about it out loud without risk. Because it's risky to do it here.
Yeah. One of the things I loved in college was a speech and debate class, because you didn't know for sure which side of an argument you were going to get. And the teacher would assign, okay, you're pro-nuclear weapons or you're anti-nuclear weapons. And off you go. Now you've got to want to win the debate, obviously, for the best score. So you've got to do research on that side, even if you don't believe in it.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting to me is if you look at the great academic institutions of this country, not your personal opinion today, but like the ones who are on the list of the greats, right? Guess who started those? The church. We were people that led the way in valuing thinking like that.
Yeah.
Some of the great the greats in these works that they suggested reading are followers of Jesus, that were Enlightenment thinkers who were passionate about the gospel, but also could think critically about the meaning of life and the nature of humanity and things like that. We're chatting about, I thought, a really thought-provoking editorial from the New York Times about so many Americans being frustrated with higher education after watching really horrid behavior in college protests. Both sides of the aisle seemingly frustrated by it. And this particular person is calling for almost a rediscovery of an actual liberal arts education, where in colleges, the first 2 years used to be you're forced to take 2 years of material outside of your major to teach you to be a citizen, to think critically. So this piece ends with, liberal arts education is not value neutral. That's why it's indispensable today. Freedom of thought, critical reasoning, empathy for others, and respectful disagreement are paramount for a flourishing democratic society. Without them, we get the unreasoned condemnation so pervasive in today's malignant public discourse. With them, we have a hope of furthering the shared governance that is vital to American pluralistic society. And I mentioned before the break as well that Christians were the ones who instituted many higher education institutions across the globe. We used to value this. And we got a great quote from Jacob and Maslin throwing down Plato at 6:30 in the morning, right?
Yeah, he said, this helped me expand my faith. Plato said, quote, "He is a true genius who can entertain an idea without believing it."
What does that mean to you guys?
I think how we would call it today is being called like a devil's advocate, where you're trying to play another side just to see how it works out.
Yeah.
And to see if it works. And not necessarily that you believe that, but you're kind of trying it on to see how it fits within the discussion.
And especially as Christians, there's value in being able to understand the other side. Like, so many people just shut it down. Nope, I don't want to know how they think. It's evil. But no, they might have valid reasons. And when you begin to understand that, you can start to build bridges.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm recalling one of my first years teaching. We were teaching, I forget what the particular unit was, something about cultural geography or something, right? About examining different cultural attributes. And one of the stories we read was about, you remember the Matthew Shepard? He was a young homosexual boy who was beat up and murdered. And so we were trying to teach what is the concept. Now, people are going to be triggered by this, so breathe. Concept of actual tolerance. What is it, right? And so we talked about that. And the moral of the story, of course, is don't murder people for being different than you, right?
Right.
I had a Christian dad in conferences go after me. How dare you teach my kid about this, indoctrinate my kid about homosexuality? I go, whoa, actually, it wasn't really about homosexuality at all. It was, but it could have been about anything. It was about don't kill people that disagree with you. And he had a real hard time with that.
Wow. That's shocking to me. Come on, Dad. He needs the Old Spice slap across the face and say, welcome to the world. You need to think a little bit.
That's just it, though, right?
People are different.
Exactly your
than
point.
You've got to think a little bit. I mean, I've never been scared of my kids being taught about evolution, Hinduism, Buddhism, because I have confidence that, you know what the best idea is when fully intellectually tested? The gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
I don't have to be scared of evolution. Teach all you want. It's a silly idea. I mean, it really is.
Yeah.
But we see it as a threat. I think it's actually counteractive when you scare your kids. Oh, don't learn about that evolution. Oh, it's so scary. All these don't learn about that.
It gives it way more power than it deserves.
Learn about that silly idea. It's terrible.
I mean, it's a theory. It's a prevailing theory. And even the most staunch evolutionary proponents have to admit it's a theory. We have a duty to understand what the world is thinking and where their head is. Like, we have to know these things at the very least.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking about how powerful a discussion I had with high school juniors when I was teaching the Enlightenment, and we were talking about the Enlightenment, which was in like the 1700s, which, by the way, inspired the American Revolution. if you look at the Declaration of Independence, John Locke's ideas are, dare I say, almost plagiarized by Thomas Jefferson. When you read his second treatise on government, we actually did that, blah, blah, blah. I get nerdy on this stuff, so I'll stop. But nonetheless, there was this deep debate for, many years, still today. Are people inherently good or inherently bad? It was a secular debate. And philosophers would do long writings, treatises on this, long essays. People would get together and debate it. What better thing to debate as a Christian? And I listened to these juniors try to grapple with whether people are inherently good or not. I thought that was one of the best things I could have done as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I could see, it didn't happen, but I could see a Christian parent getting mad at me. How dare you try to teach my kids that people are inherently good? I'm not trying to teach them that. I'm trying to get them to examine it for themselves. This is what we've lost.
Yes.
So how do we get it back? Like, what does it look like for the church to move forward in a way where we are not scared of other ideas or condemning of other ideas?
I could see the right person in a local church maybe putting together it might be a one-time meeting at first where the high schoolers are invited in and we're going to talk about some issues. And if you get the right group, that might take off.
Mm-hmm.
But varies from church to church whether you've got the right person to lead it and the right kids to be part of it. It might fall apart completely in another church.
It's a tough one. I would say you could also cultivate curiosity, make that a Christian virtue. Being curious. Because I think we've lost curiosity as a society as well. It's like, I don't really care what you think. I want you to sit and listen to what I think.
I think part of the problem is in our digital age, we've got algorithms that are basically mind readers. Our feeds are perfectly crafted to what you want to see, what points of view you want to hear. You don't have to be exposed to anything different if you don't want to be. And each generations, the older and the younger ones, have their own different reasons and ways in which they completely reject new thinking.
Yeah. I think there's a way to do it. I mean, I don't have it all figured out. But I mean, part of it's calming down and stop seeing diverging ideas as scary. If you truly believe the gospel's true, you have nothing to worry about. I mean, we have to have some measure of relaxation and peace in the power of the gospel. I'm hopeful. I think we can do it, but it's going to take a dramatic shift. And it's going to take new leaders like Tim Keller. You mentioned this to me in a break, Lauren, that it's been about a year since Tim Keller passed. And I remember listening to a podcast where he was asked to debate an atheist. And it was the most friendly debate I've ever heard in my whole life. It really wasn't a debate. And the most memorable parts were when Tim Keller changed the entire tone of it by a couple of times. The atheist would make a point and ask him to respond, and he'd go, you know what? I don't think I'm going to respond because I think you made a really great point. And everybody in the podcast was like, what? You can't do that. But he did, because it was a good point. It didn't compromise the gospel, but he was able to value the other person by saying, it's a really interesting thought, an idea, and I concede that to you. Good for you. Mm-hmm. Powerful stuff. Mm-hmm. If you want to see the piece, it's in the New York Times. It's called Higher Education Needs More Socrates and Plato. And dare I say, we all need more of that in our lives today.